On a quiet morning before dawn, while most people were still asleep, 15-year-old Nicole Vandenherk got on her bicycle and headed to work. It was an ordinary ride she had taken before, but this time she would never reach her destination. Her disappearance would become one of the Netherlands' most haunting unsolved murder cases, remaining a mystery for nearly 20 years. What finally brought investigators closer to the truth wasn't a lucky discovery, a surprise confession, or a detective suddenly uncovering forgotten evidence. Instead, the breakthrough came from a single lie that unraveled years after the crime had been committed. This is the tragic story of Nicole Van Herk, a case marked by heartbreak, unanswered questions, and a long search for justice. Nicole was born on July 4, 1980, in a small town in Germany. At birth, her surname was Tedemeijer. Her mother, Angelica, raised her alone during her early childhood until she met a Dutch musician named Ad van den Herk. The two eventually married, giving Nicole not only a new stepfather but also a new surname and a fresh start. When Nicole was around 3 years old, the family moved from Germany to the Netherlands. Her biological father remained in Germany, while Nicole began building a new life with her mother and stepfather. After the marriage, she officially became known as Nicole van den Herk. Despite the new beginning, life at home wasn't easy. Angelica struggled with serious mental health issues. There were long periods when she isolated herself from everyone, making it difficult for Nicole to develop the close relationship she longed for with her mother. Emotional distance became a constant part of Nicole's childhood. In 1989, when Nicole was 8 years old, her parents separated. Following the divorce, custody was awarded to Ad, who became her primary caregiver. Raising a young daughter while working long hours in the music industry was challenging, so he often relied on his own mother for help. Nicole's grandmother soon became one of the most important people in her life. Along with her younger stepbrother, Andy, Nicole spent many nights and weekends at her grandmother's home. It was a place where she felt secure, supported, and loved. As time passed, that house became her safe haven. Later, Ad married a woman named Yolanda, who also worked in the music business. She got along well with both Nicole and Andy, but because both adults had demanding careers, Nicole's grandmother continued playing a major role in raising the children. Another devastating loss came in April 1995, when Nicole's biological mother, Angelica, died in the Dutch city of Tilburg. The exact circumstances surrounding her death were never fully explained publicly. After years of separation caused by illness and custody arrangements, Nicole had hoped that one day she and her mother might rebuild their relationship. That hope disappeared forever with her mother's passing. By the autumn of 1995, Nicole was 15 years old and spending much of her time at her grandmother's home. Like many teenagers, she had become increasingly independent. Between school, a part-time job, spending time with close friends, and her boyfriend, her days were busy. She was beginning to shape her own future, trying to move beyond the hardships that had defined much of her childhood. To those around her, Nicole was simply a teenager looking forward to the next chapter of her life. No one could have imagined that her normal routine would soon be interrupted by a tragedy that would shock the nation and remain unsolved for decades. As Nicole grew older, she spent less time at home. School, her part-time job, close friends, and a boyfriend kept her busy, giving her a sense of normal teenage life despite the hardships she had experienced growing up. Not long before she disappeared, Nicole shared something troubling with one of her aunts. She explained that an unfamiliar man had followed her and made her feel unsafe while she was walking home. Although the incident worried her, no formal action was taken, and the encounter was never fully investigated. Before sunrise on Friday, October 6, 1995, Nicole left her grandmother's house for work. At around 5 a.m., she climbed onto her bicycle and began her usual ride to a supermarket where she had recently started a temporary holiday job. The early shift required her to leave while it was still dark, but the route was one she knew well. That morning, however, Nicole never arrived. When she failed to report for work, her co-workers initially assumed she was running late. As more time passed, concern quickly replaced confusion. A missed shift led to phone calls, and before long, police were notified that the 15-year-old was missing. The search began immediately. Later that same evening, at approximately 6 p.m., investigators made their first major discovery. Nicole's bicycle was recovered from the Dommel River, which runs through the Eindhoven area along the route she would have taken that morning. Finding the bicycle dramatically changed the investigation. Officers expanded the search around nearby bridges, riverbanks, cycling paths, and walking trails, believing the river could hold important clues about what had happened. For the next 11 days, from October 6 to October 17, search teams combed the area with extraordinary effort. Divers searched the waterways, while officers and volunteers examined nearby forests and open land section by section. Every possible location was carefully checked. Public attention to the case grew rapidly. A Dutch television program also organized a large-scale search operation, bringing in volunteers and specially trained search dogs. Much of the effort focused on the Bosdijk area, which had repeatedly been mentioned during the investigation. Despite the extensive search, nothing was found. Then, on October 19, investigators uncovered another important piece of evidence. Nicole's small backpack was discovered near a canal, between the Dave Industrial Complex and the Eindhoven Canal. This discovery raised new questions. Her bicycle had been found in one part of the city, while her backpack appeared in another location entirely. Investigators believed this separation was unlikely to be a coincidence and suggested that someone had deliberately moved her belongings. The following day, police searched the canal and surrounding southern banks in detail. Additional searches were carried out again on October 28 and 29, but they still found no trace of Nicole herself. As the weeks passed, speculation spread. Some wondered if Nicole had voluntarily left the country, especially since her biological father and other relatives still lived in Germany. However, her stepfather strongly rejected that theory. He insisted Nicole would never disappear without telling her family and believed she had become the victim of a serious crime. By November 20, investigators had received roughly 300 tips from members of the public. Although many leads were examined, none identified a credible suspect. Police had recovered Nicole's bicycle and backpack, yet her whereabouts remained unknown. Changed on Wednesday, November 20, 1995. A person walking through a wooded area between Mirlo and Lierop noticed something hidden beneath a pile of branches and garden waste. The horrifying discovery was Nicole's body. Nearly 7 weeks had passed since she disappeared. She was found approximately 10 kilometers east of her grandmother's home, far from the locations where her bicycle and backpack had been recovered. Investigators quickly realized that whoever had left her there had intentionally concealed the body beneath branches and debris in an apparent attempt to delay its discovery. The location suggested careful planning. The distance from the earlier search areas indicated that the offender had deliberately chosen a place unlikely to attract attention. Unfortunately, weeks of exposure to changing weather, insects, bacteria, and natural decomposition had severely affected the forensic evidence. Despite these challenges, investigators carefully collected every piece of biological evidence they could preserve. Clothing fibers, hair, and several DNA samples were secured, including samples recovered from Nicole's body and her clothing. Although forensic technology in 1995 was far less advanced than it is today, detectives understood the importance of preserving everything for possible future testing. The autopsy confirmed that Nicole had died as the result of an extremely violent attack. Medical examiners determined that the fatal injury was a stab wound that caused massive internal bleeding. They also documented a fractured jaw, significant head injuries, and wounds to her fingers. Those injuries suggested that Nicole had desperately tried to defend herself during the assault, fighting to survive until the very end. The injuries to Nicole's hands strongly indicated that she had tried to defend herself during the attack. Investigators also discovered evidence that she had been sexually assaulted. However, they made the decision not to reveal that information to the public. Instead, the finding remained confidential and was documented only within the official case files. On November 28, 1995, family and friends gathered to lay Nicole to rest. Even before her body had been found, investigators had received a mysterious lead. On October 24th, an anonymous man phoned the police and claimed that he knew who had killed Nicole. Before officers could ask for details or identify the caller, the conversation suddenly ended. Although the caller never provided a name or location, police had managed to record the call. In January 1996, investigators released the recording on national television, hoping someone would recognize the voice or that the caller would contact them again. Neither happened, and the mystery surrounding the call remained unsolved. Another possible breakthrough appeared just a month later. In February 1996, a family acquaintance was arrested on unrelated drug trafficking charge. While in custody, the individual accused several men of forcing them into drug smuggling and also alleged that those same men were responsible for Nicole's murder. For Nicole's stepfather, Ad van den Horck, it seemed like the investigation had finally found a promising lead. Detectives carefully examined the allegations, interviewed those involved, and checked every detail. In the end, the claims could not be supported by evidence. The story fell apart under investigation, leaving police with yet another dead end. The pattern became painfully familiar. New tips continued to arrive, each raising fresh hope, but none could be proven. A magazine even offered a cash reward for information that might identify Nicole's killer, encouraging more people to come forward. Although investigators received additional reports, none were strong enough to result in criminal charges. As months passed, the investigation gradually lost momentum. The original team became smaller, new detectives took over the file, and while the case officially remained open, there were very few new developments. Nicole's murder had entered the frustrating stage that many cold cases reach. Still active on paper but making little real progress, by the summer of 1996, detectives had exhausted nearly every lead they could find, with no clear suspect. Investigators shifted their attention toward those closest to Nicole. That summer, police arrested both her stepfather, Ad, and her stepbrother, Andy. Each was questioned while being held in custody for approximately 5 days before being released. Despite the arrests, investigators found no forensic evidence linking either man to Nicole's murder. There were no witnesses placing them at the crime scene, no physical evidence connecting them to the attack, and no charges were ever filed. Legally, neither man could be tied to the crime. However, public perception told a different story. News of the arrest spread quickly, and many people assumed guilt simply because the family members had been taken into custody. Media reports emphasized that Ad was Nicole's stepfather rather than her biological father, a detail that fueled further speculation despite the absence of supporting evidence. Although both men were cleared, suspicion lingered. In a small community, rumors often survive long after investigations move on. The family, already devastated by Nicole's murder, now faced public suspicion as well. As time passed, attention slowly faded. There were no major forensic breakthroughs, no credible confessions, and no new eyewitnesses. Many detectives were reassigned to other investigations, leaving only a small team responsible for keeping Nicole's case alive. Years went by without meaningful progress. Then, in 2004, a specialized cold case unit reopened the investigation. Detectives reviewed the original evidence, re-examined witness statements, and searched for anything that might have been overlooked during the initial investigation. Unfortunately, the review produced no decisive breakthrough, and the case once again became inactive. Investigators realized that solving the murder would likely depend on one of two possibilities. Either someone with crucial information would finally come forward, or advances in forensic science would allow previously collected evidence to reveal new answers. By 2011, 16 years had passed since Nicole's body had been discovered beneath the branches in the woodland. The DNA evidence collected in 1995 had remained preserved, even though it had been gathered using the limited forensic technology available at the time and had been affected by weeks of exposure before her body was found. During those years, Nicole's stepbrother, Andy, had moved to England. Then, unexpectedly, everything changed. In 2011, Andy posted a message on Facebook claiming that he had killed his stepsister. The confession shocked everyone. Years earlier, he had been questioned and released because investigators found no evidence against him. Now, he appeared to be publicly admitting responsibility in writing. Authorities in the United Kingdom responded immediately. Andy was arrested, and on March 30, 2011, he was extradited to the Netherlands to face questioning. Investigators detained him for approximately 5 days, the same length of time he had been held back in 1996. Despite the dramatic confession, detectives soon encountered a major problem. When they examined the evidence, the confession alone was not enough. It could not be verified by the physical evidence, and investigators still lacked proof connecting Andy to Nicole's murder. Once again, the case remained without a prosecutable suspect. Despite Andy's online confession, investigators still had no evidence connecting him to Nicole's murder beyond the words he had posted on social media. There was no forensic evidence, no eyewitness testimony, and nothing that could support criminal charges. As a result, he was released. Soon afterward, Andy publicly withdrew his confession, insisting that he had never killed his stepsister. He then made another unexpected claim, accusing his own father, Ad van den Herk, of being responsible for Nicole's death. The accusation raised more questions than answers. First, Andy had admitted to the crime himself. Then he denied everything and shifted the blame to the man who had raised both children. Yet, just as before, there was no evidence linking Ad to the murder. Without supporting proof, investigators could not pursue charges against him either. Although the allegations led nowhere, something important had changed. The case, which had spent years receiving little attention, was suddenly back in the national spotlight. Andy's confession, whether true or false, had forced both the public and law enforcement to focus on Nicole's murder once again. Dutch authorities responded by assigning a new cold case team to review the investigation. For the first time in years, detectives began taking a fresh look at the evidence. What almost no one realized at the time was that Andy's confession had never been intended to convince anyone that he was guilty. It was a calculated risk. Andy later explained that he believed the only way to force investigators to reopen the case was to make himself the center of it. He understood that a confession to murder would likely lead authorities to re-examine Nicole's remains, apply modern forensic techniques, and review evidence that had remained untouched for years. It was an extraordinarily dangerous decision. A false confession carries serious legal consequences, and if events had unfolded differently, Andy could have faced conviction for a crime he insisted he had never committed. Still, he believed doing nothing was even worse. In his view, allowing the investigation to remain dormant meant the real killer might never be identified. Years later, in 2016, Andy finally explained his reasoning publicly. He said that his goal had been to convince authorities to exhume Nicole's body so that modern DNA testing could be performed. He admitted he knowingly placed himself at risk because he believed it was the only way to move the investigation forward. For 5 years after the confession, he allowed people to believe he might be responsible before revealing his true motive. Whether people agreed with his actions or not, there is little doubt that they changed the course of the investigation. In September 2011, investigators exhumed Nicole's remains. Experts at the Netherlands Forensic Institute re-examined biological evidence and clothing that had been preserved since 1995. Advances in DNA technology now allowed scientists to analyze samples that had previously been considered too damaged or too small to produce reliable results. Evidence that had been nearly unusable 16 years earlier suddenly became valuable. Following the exhumation, authorities also publicly disclosed, for the first time, that Nicole had been sexually assaulted before her death. Investigators had documented this finding during the original investigation, but had intentionally kept it confidential while the case remained active. Officials also increased the reward for information leading to the killer, offering $15,000 to encourage new witnesses to come forward. Within a week, investigators announced another major development. They confirmed that foreign DNA had been recovered from Nicole's body. The announcement generated renewed public interest and resulted in more than 20 additional tips from the public. 2 months after the forensic examination was completed, Nicole's remains were respectfully returned to her family for reburial. Most importantly, investigators finally had something they had lacked for years: a usable DNA profile. For the first time since 1995, the investigation was moving forward again. The updated forensic analysis produced results that had been impossible to obtain during the original investigation. Scientists identified DNA belonging to 3 different males. One profile matched Nicole's boyfriend, which investigators considered consistent with their relationship and not suspicious. A second profile belonged to Jose DeG, a convicted offender from Helmond. His DNA was found in biological evidence collected from Nicole's body. The third DNA profile belonged to an unidentified male whose identity could not be established. The match involving Jose DeG became especially significant because investigators noticed similarities between Nicole's case and another violent crime. In September 2000, a 20-year-old woman was attacked after being pulled from her bicycle in Valkenswaard, south of Eindhoven. The man later convicted of that assault was Jose DeG. The similarities immediately attracted the attention of the cold case investigators. In both cases, a young woman riding a bicycle was intercepted, taken to a secluded location, and violently assaulted. Nicole had disappeared while cycling to work before dawn, and her body had later been hidden in a wooded area about 10 kilometers away. Detectives compared Jose DeG's DNA with the biological evidence recovered from Nicole. The similarities were compelling enough for investigators to make an arrest and continue building the case against him. The renewed investigation eventually led detectives to a suspect. In January 2014, police arrested 46-year-old Jose DeG in Helmond. At the time, he had been living in a supervised shelter as part of a rehabilitation program and was reportedly close to completing his final stage before returning to independent living. Instead of moving forward with that plan, he was taken into custody in connection with Nicole's murder. Jose DeG had lived in Valkenswaard, a town near Eindhoven, during the mid-1990s. When Nicole disappeared in October 1995, he was in his late 20s. Investigators also reconstructed his movements in the hours before Nicole vanished. According to the investigation, on the evening of October 5, 1995, he left his former girlfriend's home after the two had argued. Several hours later, before sunrise, Nicole began her bicycle ride to work and disappeared along her usual route. By the time of his arrest in 2014, Jose DeG already had a significant criminal record. Authorities linked him through DNA to a violent sexual assault dating back to 1987, resulting in a prison sentence. He had also been convicted for violent offenses against a former girlfriend and, in another case, for sexually assaulting a 20-year-old woman in Valkenswaard. Because of concerns about his behavior and risk of reoffending, a Dutch court later ordered a period of preventive detention along with mandatory psychiatric treatment. Psychological evaluations presented during earlier legal proceedings reportedly described him as a person with serious behavioral problems and warned that he could pose a continued danger if those issues were not properly addressed. Despite those warnings, by early 2014, he was nearing the end of his supervised rehabilitation program. Outside of the legal system, he had joined an amateur football club in Helmond, where he played as a goalkeeper. Teammates later described him as friendly at times, but generally quiet and reserved. When news of the arrest became public, Andy reacted with relief. He reportedly sent messages to friends saying that, after nearly 19 years, the person responsible for Nicole's death had finally been identified. In April 2014, prosecutors formally charged Jose DeG in connection with Nicole van den Hurk's death. Nearly 2 decades after investigators found her body hidden beneath branches in a wooded area, the case finally had a named suspect. Initially, prosecutors pursued charges that included both murder and sexual assault. However, during a pretrial hearing on July 3, 2014, they revised the indictment. Prosecutors concluded that the available forensic evidence was not sufficient to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt, so the murder charge was withdrawn. Instead, Jose DeG went to trial on charges including manslaughter and sexual assault. The decision frustrated Nicole's family. Andy publicly argued that moving and concealing a victim's body demonstrated planning and should have supported a murder charge rather than the lesser offense. Nicole's stepfather, Ad, also expressed disappointment, stating that he believed the suspect deserved the maximum punishment allowed under Dutch law because of both Nicole's death and his history of violent offenses. Prosecutors requested a prison sentence of 14 years if the court found him guilty. The defense, meanwhile, sought a complete acquittal. Throughout the proceedings, Jose DeG denied responsibility. At first, he claimed he had never encountered Nicole around the time she disappeared. Later, his explanation changed. He suggested it was possible that he and Nicole had met voluntarily sometime before her death, but claimed he could not remember such an encounter. His defense argued that they may have visited some of the same places, making an accidental meeting possible. The defense also emphasized that investigators had recovered DNA from more than one male, arguing that this created uncertainty about who had committed the crime. Prosecutors strongly rejected those arguments. They maintained that the evidence presented by the defense did not explain why Jose DeG's DNA had been found among the biological evidence collected during the investigation. By October 2015, the case had already gone through 8 pretrial hearings. Much of the legal battle focused on forensic science, rather than proving an alternative suspect. The defense concentrated on challenging the reliability and interpretation of the DNA evidence itself. The central issue before the court became whether the genetic evidence was strong enough to establish Jose DeG's involvement in Nicole's murder beyond a reasonable doubt. The trial centered on one crucial piece of evidence: the DNA recovered from Nicole's body. Forensic experts had never been able to obtain a complete genetic profile from the biological material collected in 1995. Years of exposure to the outdoors had severely damaged the evidence before it was recovered. Even specialists brought in by the defense agreed that the DNA sample was unusual. Under normal circumstances, semen evidence often produces a complete profile, but this case was far from ordinary. Experts from the Netherlands Forensic Institute, NFI, explained that the condition of the evidence made analysis extremely difficult. After nearly 6 weeks of exposure to weather, decomposition, and environmental contamination, it was remarkable that any usable DNA had survived at all. Investigators also determined that the biological sample contained DNA from multiple individuals. 2 profiles could be identified with confidence, belonging to Nicole's boyfriend and another matching Jose DeG. However, additional genetic material could not be conclusively attributed to either person. Because experts disagreed about how the mixed DNA should be interpreted, the court sought an independent review. The evidence was sent to specialists in New Zealand, where analysts used an advanced technique known as probabilistic genotyping. This method applies statistical modeling to separate complex DNA mixtures that contain genetic material from several people. At the time, the technology had never before been used in a Dutch criminal case. When the results were presented in April 2016, they significantly strengthened the prosecution's case. According to the statistical analysis, the probability that the DNA mixture included Jose DeG and 2 specific individuals was more than 28 million times greater than the likelihood that it belonged to 3 unrelated people. Although the findings strongly supported the presence of Jose DeG's DNA, the unidentified third profile continued to raise legal questions. The defense argued that this unknown DNA created reasonable doubt. As the trial continued, another unexpected development emerged. 2 former patients from the same psychiatric institution where Jose DeG had once been treated came forward independently. Each claimed that he had spoken about killing a young girl, and both believed he had been referring to Nicole. The court delayed proceedings to investigate those claims. 15 witnesses were called to clarify the relationships between the men involved. Jose DeG attempted to undermine one witness by claiming they had not gotten along well in treatment. However, a psychiatrist from the facility recalled seeing the 2 men spending time together, including playing poker. Despite this, the statements were ultimately excluded from the formal evidence presented at trial. Although prosecutors considered the witnesses credible, the court decided the case would proceed without relying on their testimony. On November 21, 2016, the court delivered its verdict. Jose DeG was found guilty of sexual assault and sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, he was acquitted of manslaughter. The judges explained that the unidentified third DNA profile prevented them from ruling out the possibility that another person had been involved in Nicole's death. Without stronger evidence linking Jose DeG directly to the killing, they concluded that a conviction for manslaughter could not be legally supported. The court rejected every other argument presented by the defense. Judge found no evidence that Nicole and Jose DeG knew each other before the day she disappeared. They also dismissed the suggestion that any sexual contact between them had been consensual. Instead, the biological evidence supported the conclusion that the sexual assault had been forced. Even so, the court acknowledged that the verdict left important questions unanswered. In its decision, the judges expressed regret that Nicole's family still had no clear explanation of exactly what had happened after the assault. The court also declined to order psychiatric detention under the Dutch TBS system, citing expert assessments that suggested the risk of future violent offending was low. The sentence deeply disappointed Nicole's family. Prosecutors had requested 14 years in prison, but because Jose had already spent approximately 2 years in pretrial detention, only about 3 years of the sentence remained to be served. Family members reacted emotionally inside the courtroom, expressing disbelief at what they viewed as an inadequate punishment. The legal battle, however, was far from over. Only 8 days after the verdict, both sides filed appeals. Prosecutors challenged the acquittal on the manslaughter charge, arguing that the sexual assault and the killing were part of one continuous sequence carried out by the same offender. The defense, meanwhile, appealed the sexual assault conviction. As a result, the entire case was reconsidered by the Court of Appeal. Hearings began in August 2018, with prosecutors once again requesting a 14-year prison sentence. One issue that had played a major role in the first trial was viewed differently during the appeal. The unidentified third DNA profile, which had previously created reasonable doubt, was now considered too limited to carry significant evidentiary weight. The appeal judges concluded that the tiny amount of unidentified DNA could have resulted from innocent transfer or environmental contamination and should not outweigh the stronger forensic evidence. With that issue resolved, the court focused on the remaining evidence. Jus de G's DNA had been identified multiple times in biological samples collected from Nicole. The court also considered the circumstances surrounding the crime. Nicole's body had been deliberately concealed beneath branches in a wooded area approximately 10 kilometers from where she was last seen. The judges concluded that such actions indicated an attempt to hide the crime rather than an accidental event. Taken together, the evidence supported a single sequence of events involving one offender. On October 9, 2018, the Court of Appeal found Jus de G guilty of both sexual assault and manslaughter, sentencing him to 12 years in prison. The written judgment concluded that he had sexually assaulted the 15-year-old, fatally attacked her, and concealed her body in an effort to avoid detection. More than 23 years after Nicole disappeared on her early morning bicycle ride, a court had finally held someone criminally responsible. The appeal court again declined to impose psychiatric detention under the TBS system, explaining that it was no longer possible to determine whether Jus de G's mental condition in 1995 had played a role in the crime. Jus de G made one final attempt to overturn the verdict. He appealed to the Supreme Court of the Netherlands, arguing that he had not received a fair trial and challenging both the handling of the DNA evidence and the testimony of expert witnesses. After reviewing the case, the Advocate General recommended rejecting the appeal. On June 16, 2020, the Supreme Court dismissed every remaining objection. With that decision, the conviction became final, bringing the decades-long legal process to its conclusion. Following the Supreme Court's decision, the sentence was adjusted slightly because of the length of the legal proceedings. The original 12-year prison sentence was reduced by 4 months, resulting in a final sentence of 11 years and 8 months. With that ruling, the legal process officially came to an end. One unanswered detail, however, remained. Investigators never identified the third male whose DNA appeared in the forensic evidence. Throughout the trials, both prosecutors and defense attorneys debated its significance. Ultimately, the courts concluded that the trace was too limited and too uncertain to affect the outcome of the case. Although that mystery remains unresolved, the central question had finally been answered. After decades of investigation, the courts concluded that Jus de G was responsible for the assault and death of Nicole van den Hurk, and his conviction became final. Reaching that conclusion required an extraordinary combination of events. The investigation was revived after a false confession. Nicole's remains were exhumed so modern forensic testing could be performed, and advances in DNA technology made it possible to analyze evidence that had been impossible to interpret in 1995. Years of persistence by investigators, forensic scientists, and Nicole's family ultimately led to the identification and conviction of the offender. For the family, however, the verdict could never erase decades of loss. Among those most deeply affected was Nicole's stepbrother, Andy van den Hurk. Believing the investigation had reached a dead end, Andy made the extraordinary decision to falsely confess to the crime in hopes of forcing authorities to reopen the case. His plan succeeded in bringing renewed attention to the investigation and ultimately helped trigger the forensic review that changed everything. Years later, after living through suspicion, public scrutiny, and the emotional burden of his decision, Andy shared a final message on Facebook on August 27, 2021, saying he was ready to say goodbye. Not long afterward, he died. His loss added another tragic chapter to a case that had already brought immense suffering to those closest to Nicole. Although Andy never sought recognition for his actions, many believe his willingness to risk everything played a significant role in ensuring that the investigation moved forward, when it otherwise might have remained unsolved. Nicole's stepfather, Ad van den Hurk, carried his own burden throughout those years. He had raised Nicole as his daughter, endured the pain of losing her, faced public suspicion despite never being charged, and waited more than 23 years before hearing a court finally hold someone accountable for her death. While the legal case eventually reached its conclusion, the emotional impact on Nicole's loved ones could never be measured by a verdict or a sentence. Nicole's story remains one of the Netherlands' most remarkable cold case investigations, not only because modern forensic science finally solved a decades-old crime, but also because determination, persistence, and the refusal to let the case be forgotten ultimately brought long-awaited justice. Even after so many years, Nicole van den Hurk's case continues to remind investigators and families alike that advances in science can breathe new life into even the oldest unsolved cases, offering hope that justice can still be achieved when evidence is carefully preserved and never abandoned.